The Naked Truth Report is sponsored by Kathleen Wells on AM 870, The Answer.
Welcome to the Naked Truth Report with your host, truth warrior and mythbuster, Kathleen Wells. The place where we distinguish fact from fiction, where data is used to drive points home, and where Kathleen takes the position that Democrats and black politicians have destroyed black America. Welcome to the Naked Truth Report. Now, your host, Kathleen Wells.
Good evening to my truth warriors and mythbusters. Welcome to the Naked Truth Report. We've got a great show for you today. I'm delighted to have my guest. My guest is Dan Stein, who is the president of the Federation for American Immigration Reform, better known as FAIR. Some of you are probably familiar with it. I met Mr. Stein when I went back to D.C. and went to a conference on immigration, and I'm delighted to have him as a guest today. In fact, we're going to bring him on shortly. But before I bring on Mr. Stein, I want to mention a few things. I want to talk about a few things. Last week we had Dr. Claude Anderson as a guest, and he gave us sort of like a brief history, an overview, a fast summary of some history. And I think that information is so very, very, very important. It's very important. I can't stress it enough. I want more people to start reading his books, particularly all Americans, but particularly Black Americans, because I think that the fact that we lack knowledge of history is having a negative impact on us. It is negatively impacting Black Americans because we are still at the bottom. We keep making the same mistakes over and over and over and over again. The same mistakes over. And that, you know why? You know why we make the same mistakes over again? Because we don't know history. That's important. History is important. And that's why I want to encourage my listeners, and particularly Black Americans, to buy Dr. Claude Anderson's book. His book is titled A Black History Reader, 101 Questions You Never Thought to Ask. One of the main things that he says is that, the use of broad and ambiguous terms to describe Black Americans, terms like people of color, diversity, minorities. I mean, this is not the first time those terms were used. Do you understand that? This is not the first time those terms were used. And in fact, back in 1870, there was a code of ethics right after the Civil War. And they told Black politicians who were Republican at that time that they could not refer to Black folks as a group. That they could not refer to them as a group, that they had to refer to them as individuals, and they had to use neutral terms when Black Republicans in the Congress talked about Black folks. They had to use neutral terms, and they had to talk about Black folks, or rather they had to talk about everyone. Do you see how history is important? So if you knew that history in 1870, fast forward to today, and you know that what? They're having us use broad and ambiguous terms like diversity, like people of color, like minorities. And when those broad and ambiguous terms are used, you can know with 100% certainty that Black folks are going to be back at the straight of the bus, relegated back to the back of the bus, right? These are the things that you learn from history. And this is why it's important for Black Americans, specifically all Americans, to know history. This is so important because you have context. You have a context in order to assess anything. Otherwise, you're just repeating the same mistakes over and over again. Do you understand that? And another thing that you can learn from some of the things, I loved having Dr. Claude Anderson on because he gave us a brief summary of history. For instance, in the slaughterhouse cases, they made it clear. I think that case was decided in the 1870s, 1879 or 1872 or something like that. In the slaughterhouse cases, it was explicitly clear that when you're referring to the 13th, 14th, or 15th Amendment, you are specifically referring to Black folks who are the direct descendants of slaves. Do you understand that? Do you understand that? This is important. So, in other words, if you don't know this history, you can be bamboozled and hoodwinked by people today. Because people today are telling us that, the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment, or at least the 14th Amendment, it applies to midgets and Latinos and illegal immigrants. And do you understand? But if you knew the history, if you knew the slaughterhouse cases, I think it was 1872 or something like that, you would know that they made it explicitly clear. You would know that. And if you and also the Dred Scott decision, that's another one. What is the date on the Dred Scott decision? I think it was in the 1870s or something like that. The Dred Scott decision said that there was no law that referring to a black man that a white man a white man that need not respect anything regarding a black man. I'm paraphrasing. Do you understand that? But there were Republican senators, I think it was Thaddeus Stevens and Sumner and Benjamin, that said, well, we have to somehow correct that Dred Scott decision and do something remunerative. And that's how you came up with the 40 acres and a mule. Does that make, and $100? But do you see, context is everything. Context is everything. And you get context from knowing history. Do you understand that? And enough of us do not know history. Frank Morris said that. Frank Morris, who was a guest on this show, he said too many black Americans are ahistorical. Do you understand? Claude Anderson, he writes about the history. He writes about the history. That's why I encourage folks to go to his website, Powernomics, 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 and purchase his books. Purchase his books. Listen, his books aren't, and I looked it up. They're not like audio books. You can't listen to them. You have to actually read them, but they're worth reading. They're worth reading. They're chock full of knowledge that black Americans need to know so they're not repeating the same thing over and over again. We are still stuck at 1870, believe it or not. When we first got out of slavery, when black slaves were first released from slavery, when after the Civil War ended in the late 1800s, 1870 or something like that, we were 3,500ths away from the average white family in terms of wealth. 3,500ths away. This is right after slavery, folks, when there were only, I don't know. I mean, right after slavery, I don't know the exact percentage of black Americans right after slavery, but right after slavery, we were 3,500ths less away from the average white family. Today, 2017, we're worse. We're worse. Does that matter? You heard Dr. Claude Anderson say, and I said it the first week or second week, it would take the average black family 228 years to catch up to the average white family. Hello, that bothers me. Does it bother you? It should bother you. And you're going to be at zero median wealth by 2053. Some estimates say. This is a bad sign after being in a country for 500 years, right? We're going backwards. We're going backwards. Anyway, that was my little thing. I think it's important. I want to encourage people to read. Go to Dr. Claude Anderson's website, Powernomics. He has the think tank, the Harvest Institute. Buy the book, A Black History Reader. Please, I'm begging you. I read it. It's not that expensive. I think it's $30, but it's so worth it and so chock full of information that we need to understand so that we're not repeating the same things over and over. And so we know when our black politicians are handing us hogwash, we have the presence of mind, we have the knowledge base to say, well, we know that's not kosher. We know that's not cool because we were back there in 1867. It looks familiar what you're doing to me now because you did that back in 1930. Do you understand what I'm saying? You got to know the history. Anyway, I'm delighted to have my guest. I'm going to bring on my guest immediately. I'm not immediately. I'm going to bring him on right now. I'm going to bring on Mr. Stein right now because he's a wonderful guest. You know, I think if I'm going to talk about immigration, listen, I need to know what I'm talking about, right? I need to know the data. I need to know the specifics. As they say, you know, the devil is always in the details. I need to know the details. So, you know, his organization helps me to learn those details, helps me to learn that data. So, Mr. Stein, thank you for joining me on the Naked Truth Report.
I am so glad to be here tonight.
Well, I'm delighted to have you. Well, tell my listeners, what is FAIR and what is FAIR's position? FAIR is the Federation for Americans on Immigration Reform. So what is FAIR and what is your position on immigration?
FAIR was founded in 1979, and we're pretty straightforward. We're trying to ensure that immigration is something that actually helps Americans, and that if we're going to have immigration, which is a fine idea, it needs to be fair, of course, but it also needs to not displace Americans. It needs to not make it more difficult for Americans to get a good education. It needs to not reduce wages or working conditions for American workers. If we're going to have immigration, it should actually help Americans and not be used by large corporations and multinationals to essentially reduce working opportunities, wages, working conditions for workers. We also have a lot of law enforcement, of course, and we want to make sure our borders are secure. Many people wonder why they see so many people come to the country, many of them illegally. And FAIR, of course, has been at the forefront of trying to battle the special interests for many years that seek to use immigration for exploitation. And so FAIR is an anti-exploitation organization that seeks to ensure that Americans have a fair labor market and get a fair shake. Mm-hmm. So immigration in principle is a fine idea, but if it's not properly regulated, if workers can come in under exploitable working conditions, if it's being used to displace Americans, then we need to change the policy and make immigration work for America again.
Mm-hmm. So tell me currently how many legal immigrants are coming into the country?
Well, of course, when we talk about legal, we're talking of two categories: permanent, people who come permanently, and people who come temporarily to work. So of the people who come permanently, it's about 1.2 million people a year, very high, far, far higher than our historic standards. Throughout 400 years of American history, we've averaged maybe 200,000 immigrants a year, and that included the slaves that were brought in before 1865. And so what we're doing today is historically unprecedented. Far more people coming in every year. And then you have what are called non-immigrant or temporary foreign workers. And those can often be as many as another 2 or 3 million people, depending on the year and the categories. But it's a very high number of people. And then, of course, if you add that to illegal immigrants coming, which may be net 300,000 a year or 400,000 a year, we're talking about a very substantial increase in our labor force coming about through either permanent immigrants or temporary non-immigrants, they're called, temporary immigrants, or those coming illegally.
Mm-hmm. So FAIR takes the position that the immigration levels, legal and illegal, have been too high. In fact, we should have no illegal immigration. I don't like to call it immigration.
Right, sure.
But you're saying legal immigration, your position is that legal immigration has been too high. Talk to me about the negative impacts of high levels of legal immigration.
Well, of course, we've had sustained high levels of immigration, and unfortunately, much of that immigration comes in with people with less education and less skills. Now, in 1965, the law was changed to make it easier for people from all over the world to come. Before 1965, the preference was for Northern Europeans. That changed in 1965, and that was good. That was fine. But the problem is that in 1965, we put in a process of chain immigration, which meant that if an immigrant came, not only could they bring in their spouse and children, minor children, but they could also bring in extended relatives. So that's how we've got to high level of immigration, plus we have millions and millions more in the backlogs. What are the problems? One, it's not affordable. Too many immigrants are coming without the skills and education they need to compete in our, superpower post-industrial economy. So there's a mismatch between the skills the immigrants have and what the country needs. Secondly, it's unmanageable because chain migration creates expectations we can't fulfill. So people come illegally waiting for their visa. They get what they call a priority date that often can take years. And so we wind up getting a lot of people coming illegally because they believe someday down the line they're going to be able to get a green card. And then, of course, there are three basic questions, Kathleen, in immigration. How many are you going to admit? Who are they going to be? And how do you enforce the rules? The question of how you enforce the rules and who are they going to be, basically the American people don't get to decide how many are coming in if we can't enforce the rules, and if the immigrants themselves are the ones who are deciding the future immigrants through chain immigration. And so FAIR is trying to bring immigration levels down to the lowest possible level, restructure the system so that if you decide you want to bring a person in, you bring in spouse and unmarried minor children. But instead, we got billions of people all over the world, all over the planet that want to move here. And anybody who's lived in California can see that the combination of low-skill immigration, legal immigration, illegal immigration, asylum seekers, refugees, and other categories, you had the displacement of entire populations in California. And many of the people who designed the 1965 law, people like Ted Kennedy and others, did not, when they saw the impacts of the 1965 law, have the willingness to come back and say, this is not working as we intended. We need to change the law and go back to something as noble as the idea was. The way the actual law is operating needs to change, and we need to move to a system that puts less pressure on American workers and American families. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to change it.
Oh, so you're saying the politicians knew. In fact, I think I read somewhere that one of the senators, McCarthy, I may be mistaken, actually regretted the 1965, regretted approving or endorsing the 1965 Immigration Act.
Oh, yes. I mean, many of the people who were involved in that act, you're talking about Senator Eugene McCarthy, not Joseph McCarthy, but Eugene McCarthy from Minnesota. Mm-hmm. He was a senator for many, many years. He, in fact, was running for president when Lyndon Johnson declined to run for re-election and was doing very well, and he was winning. And large part of his position was in opposition to the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. And he always felt that the Democratic Party was unfair to him when they decided to run Bobby Kennedy. Mm-hmm. And that knocked Eugene McCarthy kind of out of the race. And, of course, we all know what happened to Bobby Kennedy, sadly. But Eugene McCarthy was one of those people who we would consider a classical liberal, who recognized that one of the problems, as Americans, we've come to believe that the government is here to help, and that in giving us a fair shake, we have a social safety net to make sure we don't hit bottom. Well, if the immigrants coming in are taking advantage of that exact same social safety net and programs that were designed to rectify past historical injustices, for example, the descendants of slaves, who in many ways gotten a very unfair shake as a result of the fact that these immigration laws have been used by people who've come in very recently. Mm-hmm. And so, and I know you've probably talked about that to some extent. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excuse me. But this is a basic core fact that if you set up programs that are designed to help people, but if people coming in from other countries use them, mm-hmm. they overload them. Mm-hmm. And they wind up not serving anybody effectively. And that's what's happened in public education. That's what's happened in much of our infrastructure, housing, and others. The hidden secret of the whole immigration debate, Kathleen, is very simple. When people look back at the history of immigration, they have to include the history of slavery. Mm-hmm. Because capitalism, as much as we like it as a political system, nevertheless seems to need a group of people who are subordinate, who are exploitable, who cannot defend their rights. So when slavery was abolished, everybody was hoping that the tight labor markets that were produced as a result of that would benefit to the African Americans, descendants of slaves. Mm-hmm. Immediately, if you go back and look at history, you'll see, starting in 1870, 1865, 1870, first it was the contract labor from China. Mm-hmm. An awful lot of the Civil War was fought over the question of free labor versus slave labor.
Mm-hmm.
Slave labor and free labor can't coexist in the same labor market. Once the slaves were freed, the capitalists had to find another avenue to bring in exploited labor that couldn't defend its rights.
Mm-hmm.
And they started on two avenues. One was contract labor, and the other was illegal labor.
Mm-hmm.
You'll notice, all the way through, the major progress that was made for the African American community took place after the Second World War, when there was very low immigration and there was a tight labor market, and the civil rights movement happened at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And you saw a really strong narrowing in gap between rich and poor, and we saw a strong, stable middle class, including the African American community. Mm-hmm. 1965, a couple of things happened. One is they continued the Bracero program. This was a program started in World War II, 1943,
mm-hmm.
continued all the way through 1965. The second thing was that they expanded other guest worker programs. And ultimately what's been going on here is that the tight labor market that would ensure that everybody had a shot at the American dream and ensure that there would be jobs with dignity for all Americans.
Mm-hmm.
There's been this continued undercutting of Americans who don't have certain privileges in our society by virtue of these non-immigrant programs, these guest worker programs, and the illegal immigration that continues to pour into the country.
Mm-hmm. And
this desperation factor, if you give me three people who cannot defend their rights, as an employer, I'm going to prefer them over Americans who can defend their rights.
Mm-hmm.
And yet you hear in our society, including many of the leaders in the African American political community, and I commend your courage in confronting them directly. You're an outstanding American to call them on it.
Oh, wow. That sounds great. I mean, thank you. Thank you for saying I'm an outstanding American. Yes, I am. Black Americans have been in this country 400 years. And this is important because I come from a family that has contributed their blood, sweat, and toil to America. Blacks and whites built America. So it's important.
Right.
I'm living on my ancestors' shoulders, right?
Well, yes, and you talk about understanding history, and I have a great quote from Daniel Borston, who is the Librarian of Congress.
Mm-hmm.
He says, "Trying to understand the present, trying to understand today,
mm-hmm.
without understanding history, is like trying to cut flowers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They don't do very well.
Mm-hmm.
Planting cut flowers don't grow.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very important to understand that when the fix is in. I mean, this happens. It's not just with the African American community. I mean, this is happening to millennials all across the board who
mm-hmm.
are coming out of college today.
Mm-hmm.
Some of these non-immigrant visa programs, like the B1 program, which you may have heard about if you were to one of those meetings the other week,
mm-hmm.
which is supposed to be a visa program for people coming for business, is being used to hire low-cost labor under these temporary visa programs. Millennials are going through job interviews thinking they have a fair shot at these jobs, and they don't.
Right. I've heard you say that. I've heard you say that kids like 30 years old will not have an opportunity to go and get into the middle class at the way we're bringing in immigrants, legal and illegal.
Yeah, and the thing is that many of the people in our society, the political leaders, the people with power,
mm-hmm.
ought to know better. But the problem is they are bought up by, basically, if you want to rise in our political system, Kathleen, you have to raise money. Who are you raising money from? You have to raise money from the very same interests that believe immigration is important to moderate and lower labor cost. Wages have not been rising. You take a look at what's been happening in the last 20 years. Strong economy, particularly lately in the last several years. Why are wages stagnant?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there are several reasons, including outsourcing the surplus of low-cost labor around the world and the knowledge industry and trade, but immigration is a major factor. Nobody can walk around California today and not see what has happened to how labor is valued.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what ultimately determines how much a job pays? And it's certainly not based on the cost of living, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you want to live in California, you need a better job than minimum wage. So what is it that determines the cost of the value of a job and what it pays?
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty much whatever employers believe they have to pay.
Right.
So remember, we would not have had a union movement in this country. We didn't bring immigration down until 1921, and it wasn't until there were major labor riots. It wasn't until the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, 1918, the captains of industry began to become concerned that the communist revolution would actually spread to the U.S. So they brought immigration down in 1921, and then Congress passed statutes that enabled workers to organize. And then we had the Pullman Car Union and other very distinguished unions in our country that actually gave people a shot at bargaining leverage with employers. Without immigration controls, this country never would have had an organized labor movement. And not surprisingly, as immigration has dramatically increased since 1975, the percent of Americans who are working in the private sector who belong to unions has declined to like about 9%. Unless you're a government employee, you're pretty much not in a union unless you're, working in Hollywood or something, or, acting. And so, what this means is that the Democratic Party, which used to be concerned about protecting American workers, no longer has a labor union component in it. It's now made up of trying to re-engineer the demographics through mass immigration. And of course, the Democrats rely very heavily on the reliability of the African American vote. And because the Democrats don't have to fight for the African American vote, which may have made sense in 1968 or 1970, but to not ever put your vote in play as a community. I'm not saying you personally, but I'm saying if the Democrats believe they take that vote for granted, then they start looking at other constituents that they're trying to please. And right now they're battling Republicans for the Hispanic vote. Right.
We're going to take, Mr. Stein, we're going to take a break right now. We're going to talk about Dreamers when we come back and also open the phone lines. We'll be right back.
Well, you have it coming to you.
Are you a local business owner? Are you interested in increasing customer counts and store traffic or increasing traffic to your website? If you answered yes, then you need to advertise on the Naked Truth Report. For more information on how to become a sponsor, please reach out to RJ Beaton at 818-517-KRLA. That's 818-517-5752. Or email us at rj@krla870.com. That's rj@krla870.com. Kathleen Wells, the host of the Naked Truth Report, wants to hear from you. Just like our borders, the phone lines, well, they're wide open. Call in at 866-870-KRLA. That's 866-870-5752. 866-870-KRLA.
Welcome back to the Naked Truth Report with my guest, Dan Stein. And we're going to talk about Dreamers right now. But one thing, they're yelling at me on my Facebook page. They're saying that you said slaves were immigrants. Slaves were not immigrants, were they, Dan Stein? You didn't say that, did you?
Well, no, I didn't. I didn't say. What I was saying was I'm talking about the number of people who came into this country one way or the other on an absolute numerical basis.
Okay.
Slaves. Well, there were different kinds of slaves. Remember, before the Civil War, you had African American slaves who were bought and sold, right, through transshipment and then sold either on the docks in Africa or sold here. And then you had indentured servants and others. Many of the indentured servants who were in prison in England and other places were here. They often were indentured for long periods of time, at least 7 years. Over a period of time, but there are various forms of slavery here before the Civil War, and the different states abolished those forms of slavery in different stages. Before the Civil War, pretty much by the time the United States basically became a country, slavery had been abolished in most of the New England states. But anyway, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't exactly know what I was.
That's okay, but African slaves were not immigrants. I'm clear about that, but let's give out the call-in number, okay? 866-870-5752. That's 866-870-5752. And let's talk about dream. Oh, actually, I want to go back a little bit because you were talking about the Democratic Party. I want to talk about the Democratic Party for a second, and then we'll talk about the Dreamers. You were saying that the Democratic Party has. I heard you say that the Democratic Party has basically given, this. How do I want to put it? I'm looking it up real quick. You said something to the effect that the Democratic Party is trying, because of the demographics, is trying to change to some sort of like a one-party model. Do you get what I'm saying there? The California.
Well, they're trying to recreate the one-party model that they have in California.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but when the Democrats, the Democrats have enjoyed a redistricting process, which has given them a lot of safe seats. But at the same time, they've also lost the labor union base that was a big part of the party. That's part of why Hillary Clinton lost in those states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio. She lost those old union states, in part because Donald Trump occupied some of that space regarding jobs and trade agreements and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But what's happened is the Democratic Party has changed. It's not the party it used to be. The immigration positions of the Democratic Party were historically for restricting immigration, border control, and ensuring that immigrants didn't unfairly compete against American workers. And between the 1980s and 2005, that dramatically changed. If you listen to Hillary Clinton in 1993 or Harry Reid in 1992,
mm-hmm.
they sound like Donald Trump when it comes to immigration.
Exactly.
What happened? What happened was the Democrats started trying to organize these new districts around emerging minorities, which included a lot of the immigrants coming in. And
mm-hmm.
as a result of the fact that they no longer have to be concerned about labor unions,
mm-hmm.
they feel free to ignore the impact of immigration on the working people of this country and are now all in. As you know, when you talk to people like Al Sharpton and Sheila Jackson Lee and others,
mm-hmm.
they basically say, we're going to bring in as many immigrants as we can, as fast as we can, because they vote Democrat basically very heavily for at least the first 10 years they're here.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't really care about, at this point, about the impact on American workers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's not the historic position of the Democratic Party, at least not since Franklin Roosevelt.
Mm-hmm. In fact, I found that you said that immigration on demand. You're saying the Democratic Party has taken the position of like immigration on demand. Anybody can come in. It's all cool and everything. Let's now talk about this Dreamers business.
Yeah. Well, you look at Jerry Brown. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you're a citizen or not a citizen. And I mean, we talk about the contributions that the various generations of Americans have made, including the descendants of slaves,
mm-hmm. people
who have given their life's blood, fought and died in the defense of this country.
mm-hmm.
To hear these politicians talk today,
mm-hmm.
you would think that the people who are the descendants of people who've been here for 20 generations
mm-hmm.
deserve no more consideration than someone who's here illegally
mm-hmm.
and been here for, 3 or 4 years.
Oh, yeah. And, that's what I'm trying to get my audience to begin to appreciate that fact. Make those distinctions. Yes, of course. I need more Democrats. I need more Black Americans and more Democrats to understand those distinctions. Are you still on the line?
Yeah, I'm right here.
Oh, yeah. I agree with you. But so
go ahead.
I'm listening.
Yeah, go ahead.
No.
Well, no, the basic core problem is it's about power.
Mm-hmm.
And the power curve changes over time as the political base changes.
Mm-hmm.
Because Democrats have decided to carve out these safe seats because of the Voting Rights Act, you have this polarization in the country, right? You have the very wide difference between the two political parties. The problem is that the African-American community finds itself within the Democratic framework, and the Democratic Party now has an interest in maximizing immigration. Legal, illegal, doesn't matter which, because it advances the power curve of the party itself,
mm-hmm.
rather than being good public policy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we see this headlong rush to reward illegality, to let anybody who comes into the country stay, unless they're a terrorist
mm-hmm.
or violent felon.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty much the Democratic Party doesn't believe anybody should ever have to leave.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the reality is, if you don't understand history, we don't understand that it's very important that we have a tight labor market. Employers need the incentive to recruit American workers, and if you're talking about young Americans today who maybe come from broken families, who are struggling, it is often employers who, when they have the incentive, reach out and give folks a hand along the way in understanding what it means, to be responsible, to show up and hold a job. And that incentive doesn't exist if employers believe they can just continue to hire a stream of people who, in many cases, not being here illegally, they are vulnerable and therefore exploitable and therefore more attractive. An employer will prefer to hire someone here illegally by virtue of the fact that they are here illegally. And what's really interesting is the employers don't want amnesty, even though the Democratic Party does. Democrats want them to vote. The employers do not want them to get amnesty because the employer wants them to be fearful and exploited, which is what we're slaves, fearful and exploited. This is what the economic motor that drives this whole division is ultimately, these major multinationals, major corporations that are trying to continue to use immigration. And sadly, because the Democrats believe it advances their short-term power agenda,
right,
they're oblivious to the fact that how this is hurting American working families.
Yeah, I'm trying to make it clear. Why don't we take a call now from Ray? He wants to talk about Dreamers. Ray in Santa Clarita. Hi, Ray.
Hi. I was calling because I wanted to discuss the Dreamers, how affirmative action is now. Since there's no longer affirmative action for the blacks, and they got rid of it, now they're replacing the blacks with like the Mexicans or other races, like the Dreamers. And so the people like me, or the people that it took the blacks so many years to get their education, to try to get some education, the people that did have to pay for their own, they wouldn't allow me to get financial aid. But now the Dreamers, they're saying that they're giving all of them financial aid out of our tax dollars.
Do you have a question for Mr. Stein?
Yes, I'm just wondering. He was talking about the people that are being exploited. So I'm just wondering that, why is it that, the government or any of the jobs that contract their work out to these firms, why can't they hire, the black people now? I mean, instead of them, most of the blacks are being put in jail instead of getting a job.
Okay, thank you, Ray. Yeah, we're sort of addressing that in a general sense. It's about a competition in the labor market, right, Mr. Stein?
Well, yeah. I mean, of course, we've outsourced a lot of jobs. We've seen displacement in many industries where, historically Americans of all stripes, types have been able to get a foot up off the ladder. One of the problems is, look, immigrants are very fashionable. They're very fashionable among the intelligentsia of the country, the elite, right? Because, African Americans and other minority communities that have been here for a long time are not quite as fashionable as the newcomers who are just coming in. And you see major law firms putting a lot of pro bono legal help into ensuring the Dreamers and other people here illegally never have to be deported. And for some reason, there's so many foreign born in this country now that they're sort of draining off the goodwill of what used to be concerned for Americans who are struggling. And so, you really see this misallocation of resources. And in the end, if employers have this steady stream of people coming in who are easily exploited, as I mentioned earlier, young people today are losing the opportunity to get those entry-level jobs, whether it's in fast food or construction or what have you, that they would have had but for the presence of so many immigrants coming in, that normally give people that chance to understand what it means to develop good skills, work habits, build a career, and do what you have to do to grow. So you see this alienation that comes about as a result of not being welcomed by those employers who, much prefer to hire either the very recent immigrant, low skill, or the illegal immigrant, illegal alien. And that's caused its displacement. And so, it doesn't really matter what community we're talking about. Young people today don't have the opportunity to get those entry level or those summer jobs that they used to have. And in a place like California, you've actually seen major displacement where communities that were in California, and obviously the African American community in East Central LA, many people have left, going back to the South or other places.
Yeah, we're down to 6%.
Migration.
Yeah, we're down to 6%. Yeah, I mean, black people are basically invisible in Los Angeles, and it's a warning. We're warning other states. You know what I mean? But I don't know.
Well, they also have a discrimination because of bilingualism. In other words, if you don't speak Spanish,
exactly.
You know, but if you're a laid-off firefighter in Dayton, Ohio, you have no way of going to Los Angeles to get a job if you don't speak Spanish, or go to Miami. No, so you've had this incredible discrimination against the African American community in LA because basically most people didn't speak Spanish.
And I hear,
so,
yeah.
You know,
Yeah, you know, and I'm going to have someone come on next week to talk about the construction industry. That has now seeped into the construction industry. In other words, you have to speak Spanish to work in construction even. Can you see how things spread? And, you know, one of the things that I heard you mention is the importance of law and order, how a sovereign nation must have boundaries in other words, to be legitimate and to be a sovereign nation, you must have borders and you must have a law and order. We no longer have law and order. And so that is seeping, you know, you see this seeping into other areas, this not abiding by the law. You want to elaborate how?
Exactly, not abiding by the law, whether it's here illegally or under labor contractors. Labor contractors are very important too. But when you look at the displacement of, you know, there have always been a lot of jobs in janitorial work in Los Angeles, lots of office buildings and what have you. You take a look at those jobs in 1983 in LA. They were unionized jobs, full-time employment for people who were working in the industry. What happened ultimately after that? Illegal immigrants started pouring into the country, into the state, and then labor contractors. These contract cleaning services. We're using labor contractors of people who may or may not have been here illegally. That drove out the unionized janitorial workforce in Los Angeles, which obviously included African Americans. It included other people too. But the point is that there's a very clear pattern, a history that you can see and you can trace of how what were better paying jobs. Being a janitor in LA might not have been a great paying job, but you actually might have been able to get a kid through college in the early 1980s if you've been a long-term janitor and enjoyed seniority in that process. And those were people who were employed ultimately by the landlords of those buildings. So between illegal immigration and labor contracting, you had this tremendous undercutting. Respect for law is the cornerstone of citizenship, Kathleen. If the first thing people do when they come here is break our immigration laws, disrespect our law, disrespect our border, disrespect our system, you're obviously starting down the wrong path for people who want to be citizens, right?
Exactly.
You're also, the worst part about this whole thing is that the way the patterns of immigration have been happening in the last 40 years is that the Americans who are in the most vulnerable position, least able to both understand how all these things work, and least able to defend themselves politically, are the people with the less education and the least amount of skills. And so it's funny that some of the very same people who said they wanted to be the bulwark of the civil rights movement in the 1960s also set off this tidal wave of immigration by 1968, 1970, 75. And the net effect is all the gains we had made by the 1950s and 60s in narrowing the gap between rich and poor and building a stable middle class have all been undone. And now we see very wealthy people on the top, no middle class, and then this big sea of poverty. And as you say, many people who've actually just left California because they simply can't survive there.
Yeah, you know, it's like, you know, Black Americans have been in an utter despair position forever, because now we are 228 years behind the average white family. And so I believe that we as a people need to just stop and have a moratorium and stop voting for these Democrats. We cannot continue this way. We cannot continue voting. We can't continue
this way. Yeah, I mean, the best thing that could happen is if we would take a timeout on immigration, for most immigration, for about 30 or 40 years, a very tight labor market that would incentivize employers to hire Americans, consider Americans. I mean, we see native-born American labor force participation is at historic lows. Now, they say the unemployment rate is very low. Well, of course, the unemployment rate doesn't measure all those Americans who basically not, given up trying to participate in the labor force. You can't, the vast presence of people here illegally as well as many people here legally with low skill, moderate skill, but we're also seeing it even in higher skill levels. The immigrants who come under what are called non-immigrant visas, I mentioned earlier, H-1B, the B-1, the L, these other categories, they are not being used as they were intended to be used. They're being used by employers in lieu of hiring American workers. And so many of these native-born Americans have simply given up. Why do they want to go out there and compete? When the immigrants come, they have these very low expectations.
So tell me, what do you think about Trump's RAISE Act? Give me your thoughts on that.
Well, I think that takes us back in the right direction. It eliminates chain migration. It makes immigration affordable by decreasing chain migration, increasing the skills composition. So we have a much lower level of immigration of the people who come. They're not being petitioned by employers. They're not cheap labor, even if they're highly skilled. Remember, there's no such thing as cheap labor. They're just cheap employers, right? And it would have a point system so that people would come with much needed skills, but they would become at much lower numbers. And they could only bring their spouse and their unmarried minor children. It would eliminate much of the refugee program and curtail asylum fraud and abuse. And it would get rid of that crazy visa lottery program that serves no real obvious purpose except to start more pressure on the system with more chain immigration. And it would bring this country really to a place where it needs to be, which is if you're going to have immigration, make sure you're not bringing in people who are competing for the very same jobs American workers are. Now, there are always going to be a place. There's always going to be those people out there around the world, the best and the brightest that everybody wants to compete with. I mean, somebody can come in and invent the technological equivalent of the airplane and attract a lot of capital and create a lot of jobs. So, if we don't take those engineers and those other people who have that extraordinary skill, then other countries will. So we should try to compete with them. But the vast majority of immigrants we don't need. And the RAISE Act moves us as a country back to something that would make a little more sense.
And, there was a New York Times piece recently comparing and contrasting the benefits, or comparing and contrasting globalism versus nationalism. You want to touch on that?
Well, yeah, globalization is kind of where the elites have all gone. I mean, there's been this tendency among the people who are in the thrall of tech, who believe that this globalization is the world of tomorrow, but nation states don't matter, that our duty and loyalty to one another as Americans doesn't matter, that it's more important to be a citizen of the world. And this kind of naive, very childlike attitude that somehow, nation states don't matter. Of course, nation states matter. Our obligation is to one another as Americans. We look to one another. We enfranchise capital, major corporations, with the protection of incorporation, because the obligation is they're going to use that capital to manufacture things and put Americans to work. If you have corporations, but basically all the jobs are being moved overseas, then why give them the protection of the capital accumulation mechanism of the corporate charter? So, and our democratic system, Kathleen, it depends upon the jurisdiction of the soil, the land. I mean, where you live, where your residency, you're mayor of a town, you're governor of a state. These things, true democracy is defined by an attachment to the soil. This whole idea of globalization would mean that we'd have a world government, and that all the countries of the world would disappear, and that somehow we could all be represented by one, what do you want to call it?
A one world government. Yeah.
I mean, the way things are done today, still most effectively, is by nation states, and that obligation we owe to one another as Americans is somehow being lost by the people at the very top, that top 1%. People who have most of the wealth in this country no longer feel that sense of obligation to make sure the rest of us have food on the table, basic income opportunities. You talk about this disparity between white families and African American families. I mean, this is completely unconscionable and is utterly pointless and should not be. It should not be. It simply shouldn't be at this juncture in our history.
However, it is. It's unconscionable, and it shouldn't be at this juncture in our history. You're hitting the nail on the head. I couldn't have said it any clearer. and something needs to be done about it.
Well, the best way, of course, are market forces. Young people are inspired to go into business when they believe that there are great rewards and opportunities. Now, if a young American tries to go into engineering right now in university, they wind up getting a teaching assistant who's probably from a country like India. And they don't understand what they're saying, and they're not inspired, and they don't particularly want to, be in the same labor market with that person, in part because, well, in the old days when you were inspired, say, 25, 35, 40 years ago, you were working in an industry where other Americans were working. And the bifurcation of these industries has made them less glamorous for Americans, and people don't really want to go into those industries. It's like when I was a kid, a long time ago now, engineers made as much money as doctors and lawyers. And we were also a country where young people got to see factories and got to see things being made. Well, average young person today, and certainly the average young person growing up in a major city today, doesn't see anything being made, doesn't see anything being manufactured, doesn't have his or her imagination fired by seeing the process of something actually becoming something. And we've taken all that away. Young people today really don't know what to do with themselves. They sit on their computers. Maybe they have an affinity for it, maybe they don't. But it's a very difficult thing when you don't have major multinationals. I mean, look at how Facebook, Microsoft, these other companies, they're so obsessed with the dreamers. They're spending millions of dollars. They call them dreamers. We have our own dreamers.
Exactly.
We have American dreamers.
Exactly.
And yet they're preoccupied. The people who came illegally, many of them came as older teens, 15, 16, 17, some of them involved in smuggling, right? Cartels. Many of them have dropped out of high school. Some of them have done very well, valedictorians. But if you actually look at the number that have graduated very well in high school, that are actually paying a reasonable amount of taxes, haven't gotten in trouble with the criminal justice system, you're talking about a pretty small number of people, all told, certainly of the entire population. And the fact of the matter is, the number of people who were brought here as infants, like in their mother's arms, and who didn't know the consequences of what they were doing, as in breaking the law, is also a small proportion of those who got in this status.
Yeah.
What President Obama did was illegal.
It was illegal. I've got to end you there. I hear the music. Mr. Stein, I really appreciate you being the guest on the Naked Truth Report. I'm going to have you on again. And I mean, this hour went by so quickly, didn't it?
I'm sorry I talk too much, but you do such a great job. You make it so easy for me.
Okay, I really appreciate it. I'm going to have you back on again, and I really appreciate you being a guest. I want my listeners to remember to go to Powernomics. Go to, the Harvest Institute or Powernomics.com and purchase Dr. Claude Anderson's book. Thank you for listening to the Naked Truth Report. See you next week.
The Naked Truth Report was sponsored by Kathleen Wells on AM 870, The Answer.